May 1946, Lethbridge, Alberta. The air smelled like fresh grass and diesel fuel. Inside the wooden office at Camp 133, the afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows and painted stripes across the floor. Captain William Henderson sat behind his desk. He was 45 years old, grey hair at his temples, deep lines around his eyes that came from seeing too much, too young. He had fought at the Somme in 1916 when he was 15, lied about his age to enlist, saw things no boy should see. Now, 30 years later, he processed German prisoners going home from another war. 3 boys stood before him in a line. They wore German army uniforms that had faded from dark grey to the colour of old dishwater. The wool hung loose on frames that had once been thinner. Their boots were scuffed and worn, but clean. Each boy kept his eyes down, staring at the wooden floor planks, counting the knots in the wood, anywhere but at the Canadian officer who held their fate in his hands. Henderson looked at the papers spread before him. Transport manifests, orders from Ottawa, directives from London, everything official, everything final. He looked up at the 3 boys. The tallest was 17, blonde hair that fell across his forehead, hands rough and calloused from 6 months of farm work. The middle boy was 16, dark brown hair, serious brown eyes that seemed older than they should be. The smallest was also 16, red hair, freckles scattered across his nose like someone had flicked paint across a canvas. His hands shook slightly at his sides. Henderson cleared his throat. Schroeder, Reinhardt, he said, reading from his list. He spoke slowly so they could understand his English. Zimmermann, Ewald, Wagner, Dieter. The boys looked up. Your transport to Halifax leaves in 3 days, June 15th. From there, you sail to Britain, then home to Germany. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Reinhard Schroeder raised his head. His blue eyes were steady. When he spoke, his English was broken but clear enough. We want to stay in Canada. Henderson blinked. He set down his pen. In 2 years of running this camp, he had seen many things. Prisoners who refused to eat, prisoners who tried to escape, prisoners who fought each other over nothing more than a stolen cigarette or an insult about Hitler. But this was new. This was impossible. Please, sir, Reinhard continued, we do not go back. Ewald Zimmermann stepped forward. He held a folder of papers against his chest like a shield. Sir, I have university papers from Saskatchewan. I study here. Engineering. In Germany, there is nothing. The 3rd boy, Dieter Wagner, said nothing. He looked like he might cry. His hand reached up and touched his throat, then dropped back to his side. Henderson leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the camp. 12,000 German prisoners getting ready to leave, packing their few belongings into canvas bags, writing last letters, saying goodbye to a place most had learned to hate, then learned to tolerate, then learned something else entirely. This moment was stranger than most people could imagine. To understand how impossible this scene was, you need to know what the world looked like in May 1946. Exactly 1 year earlier, Germany had surrendered. The Third Reich was dead. Adolf Hitler had killed himself in his bunker in Berlin, while Soviet shells rained down on the city above. The war that killed 60 million people was finally over, but Europe was destroyed. Germany was split into 4 pieces, carved up like a Christmas turkey, controlled by America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Each occupying power ruled their sector with iron authority. Berlin was a field of rubble. Hamburg was ruins. Dresden was ash. Munich was broken stones and shattered glass. Cologne's cathedral still stood, but everything around it was flattened. Millions of people wandered the roads with no homes to return to. Refugees flooded west, away from the Soviet zone, away from the Red Army's reputation for vengeance. They pushed carts loaded with everything they owned. Old women carried paintings in gilt frames. Men pulled wagons with mattresses tied on top. Children walked beside their parents with blank eyes that had seen too much. Food was scarce. Children starved in the streets of cities that once held power and wealth. The ration in the British zone was 900 calories per day, barely enough to survive, not enough to live. People ate potato peels, they boiled grass, they stood in line for 3 hours to buy a loaf of black bread that tasted like sawdust and hope. Former soldiers faced shame and suspicion everywhere they went. Nobody asked if you had been Wehrmacht or SS. Nobody cared if you had been a clerk or a combat soldier. The uniform was enough. You were guilty. You were responsible. You were the enemy who had brought this hell to the world. Germany was a wasteland of broken buildings and broken dreams. Meanwhile, here in southern Alberta, Camp 133 still stood. It covered 720 acres of flat prairie land just outside Lethbridge. Rows of wooden barracks stretched as far as the eye could see. Each building was identical: tar paper roof, wood plank walls painted military green, small windows that let in light but not much air. Guard towers rose 30 feet high at each corner of the compound, manned by Canadian soldiers with rifles who had stopped paying much attention months ago because nobody tried to escape anymore. 2 layers of barbed wire fence surrounded the entire compound. The outer fence was 10 feet high. The inner fence was 8 feet high. Between them, a 20-foot gap of dirt where nothing grew. This was the largest prisoner of war camp in all of North America. At its peak in 1944, it had held 12,500 German prisoners. Now, in May 1946, over 10,000 remained. They were waiting for ships, waiting for trains, waiting for bureaucracy to process them back to a country most no longer recognized as home. Most were regular soldiers. U-boat crews pulled from the Atlantic, paratroopers captured in Italy, tank drivers caught in France, men in their 20s and 30s who had fought because their government told them to fight, then surrendered because dead men achieved nothing. But hidden among them were approximately 300 teenagers. Some were 17 or 18, some were 16. A few were only 15 years old when they arrived. They had been swept up in the final desperate months of the war, when Germany ran out of men and started taking boys. Children pulled from their homes, given uniforms, handed rifles, told they were saving the fatherland. These were not hardened warriors. They were children in uniforms too big for their bodies. They had been in the Hitler Youth since age 10, learning to march and salute and worship the Führer like a god. Then, when Germany was losing badly, when the Eastern Front collapsed and the Western Front crumbled, the army grabbed them straight from youth camps and sent them to die. Most lasted only weeks before capture, weeks of fear and cold and hunger and artillery fire that shook the earth like God's own anger. Then British or American soldiers appeared, and the boys threw down their rifles and raised their hands because they were still smart enough to know that dead heroes are just dead. Now they sat in a Canadian prison camp, thousands of miles from home, still trying to understand what had happened to their world. The Canadian government faced a problem it had never expected. Britain wanted every single German prisoner sent back immediately, no exceptions, no delays. The orders from London were clear as crystal and just as cold. Repatriate them all, every last one. Germany needed workers to rebuild. Every prisoner sitting comfortable in Canada or America or anywhere else was one less German hauling rubble, one less pair of hands mixing concrete, one less back to break, rebuilding what the war destroyed. But thousands of Germans were begging to stay. They had written letters to members of parliament. They had filed official petitions with immigration offices. They had found Canadian farmers willing to sponsor them, Canadian families willing to vouch for them, Canadian employers willing to hire them. 6,134 men had formally requested permission to remain in Canada. Every single request was denied. And now these 3 boys stood in Henderson's office, refusing to leave. Henderson looked at them and saw the hope in their eyes. He saw the fear beneath it. He saw something else too, something that made his chest tight. These were not monsters. They were not the jack-booted thugs from propaganda posters. They were scared kids who had been lied to their entire lives. They were 16 and 17 years old. At 16, Henderson had been in a trench in France, watching his friends die in the mud. He knew what war did to boys. He had a job to do. He had orders from Ottawa, from London, from men who sat in offices and made decisions without seeing faces, without hearing voices, without looking into the eyes of teenagers who had nowhere to go. "Boys," he said quietly. The translator beside his desk repeated the words in German. "I cannot make this decision. This comes from Ottawa, from London. You are all going back." He paused. The room was silent, except for the tick of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of men shouting orders in the yard outside. "I'm sorry." Reinhard Schroeder's face fell. The hope drained from his eyes like water from a broken cup. Ewald Zimmermann's shoulders slumped. The folder of papers slipped from his hands and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Dieter Wagner let out a small sound, almost a whimper, like a dog that's been kicked. The war had ended a year ago. The killing had stopped. But for these three boys, the hardest battle was just beginning. To understand why three German boys refused to leave Canada in 1946, you need to know what they were fighting against. You need to understand what waited for them back in Germany. You need to see the three layers of stakes that made this refusal not just brave, but necessary for survival. The first layer was personal, what returning meant for them as individuals. Reinhard Schroeder came from Hamburg. His mother's name was Gertrude. She was 52 years old and had raised Reinhard alone after his father died in 1943, somewhere on the Eastern Front. Nobody knew exactly where. Nobody knew exactly when. Just gone. Missing in action. Presumed dead. One of millions who disappeared into the snow and never came back. The last letter Reinhard received from his mother arrived in March 1946. It had been opened and read by censors. Parts were blacked out with heavy ink. What remained was stark. She wrote that their apartment building had been hit by British bombs in July 1943. Half the structure collapsed. The other half still stood, barely, like a broken tooth. She lived in the basement now with 7 other people, 3 families sharing 3 rooms, no windows, no heat except what they could burn in a metal drum. The smoke made everyone cough. She wrote that food came from ration cards. The British Occupation Authority provided 900 calories per day, a slice of bread, some potato, occasionally a thin soup with bits of turnip floating in grey water. She stood in line for 2 hours every morning just to receive this ration. Sometimes the line was longer, sometimes there was no food at all. She wrote that the city looked like the moon, 74% destroyed. Streets that Reinhard remembered, filled with shops and cafes, were now valleys of rubble. The harbour where he used to watch ships was a graveyard of sunken hulls and twisted metal. The smell never went away. Smoke and rot and something else, something chemical, something that settled in your throat and wouldn't leave. She wrote that she missed him. She wrote that she loved him. She wrote that she didn't know how they would survive if he came back, because she could barely feed herself, let alone another mouth. That was Reinhard's home. That was what waited. Ewald Zimmermann came from a village near Munich, but his family was originally from Dresden. His mother and sister had been in Dresden on the night of February 13th, 1945. The night the British bombers came. The night the firestorm consumed the city. 25,000 people died that night, maybe more. Nobody knew the exact number because the bodies burned so completely there was nothing left to count. Just ash. Just the echo of screaming that survivors swore they could still hear if they closed their eyes. Ewald's mother survived. His sister did not. His father had been captured by Soviet forces in January 1945 and sent to a prison camp somewhere in Ukraine. The Red Cross had no record of him. No proof of death. No proof of life. Just another name on a list of the missing. Dresden was in the Soviet occupation zone now. That meant Ewald couldn't go back even if he wanted to. The Soviets weren't letting Germans move freely between zones. His mother had written him one letter in September 1945. It reached him in November. She said she was trying to get to the British zone. She said it was difficult. She said the Russians were not kind to German civilians. She said not to worry. He never heard from her again. Munich, where he might go instead, was in the American zone. 51% destroyed. Better than Hamburg, better than Dresden, but still a city of ruins. Still a place where former Hitler youth members were marked, watched, suspected, where university programs were closed because there were no buildings to hold classes, where engineering jobs didn't exist because there was nothing to engineer except starvation and despair. That was evil's home. That was what waited. Dieter Wagner's story was different but equally hopeless. He came from Dresden too. He was there on February 13th, 1945. He was 15 years old. He watched his city burn. His father was a music teacher at the conservatory. His mother taught piano to children of wealthy families. They lived in an apartment near the Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady, a Baroque masterpiece that had stood for 2 centuries. Dieter grew up with music. He learned violin at 6 years old. By 10, he could play Mozart and Bach from memory. His parents said he had a gift. The British bombers destroyed the Frauenkirche. It burned for 2 days, then collapsed into rubble. The conservatory burned. Their apartment building burned. Everything burned. His mother survived. A piece of shrapnel from a bomb took her left eye. She was 51 years old and worked now in a Soviet-run factory making boots for Red Army soldiers. 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. She earned enough to eat thin soup and sleep in a dormitory with 40 other women. His father died in a Soviet prison camp in November 1945. Dysentery, starvation, guards who didn't care. The notification came in January 1946. A single line on a Red Cross form. Deceased. Cause, malnutrition and disease. Dieter's beautiful violin was destroyed in the bombing. The one his parents saved for months to buy him. Destroyed. Like everything else. Like childhood. Like hope. That was Dieter's home. That was what waited. These were the personal stakes. 3 boys, 3 cities, 3 versions of hell. But the personal was only the first layer. The second layer was larger. It involved 12,500 men sitting in Camp 133. It involved the Canadian farmers and families who had written letters and signed petitions. It involved the 35,000 German prisoners held across all of Canada. It involved a question that had no good answer. What do you do with former enemies who don't want to be enemies anymore? Camp 133 held men from every branch of the German military. Luftwaffe pilots, Wehrmacht infantry, Kriegsmarine sailors, panzer crews. They ranged from 18-year-old boys to 50-year-old career officers. Some were fanatical Nazis who still believed in the cause. Some had never believed in anything except survival. Most fell somewhere in between. Of those 12,500 men, 6,134 had formally requested to stay in Canada. 6,000, nearly half. They had written letters explaining why, letters that camp administrators collected and forwarded to Ottawa, to immigration officials, to government bureaucrats who read them with varying degrees of sympathy and then filed them away because orders were orders. The letters said similar things. Germany was destroyed. There were no jobs, no homes, no future. But Canada was different. Canada had work. Canada had opportunity. Canada had shown them something they hadn't known existed. 417 farmers in southern Alberta had written supporting letters. They said the German prisoners were the best workers they'd ever had. Strong, reliable, skilled. They knew farming because many came from farming families in Bavaria or Prussia or Saxony. They understood livestock. They could drive tractors. They fixed things when they broke. Joseph Kowalski, a farmer 7 miles west of Lethbridge, had written specifically about Reinhard Schroeder. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in careful English. Joseph was 55 years old. He had come to Canada from Ukraine in the 1920s, fleeing civil war and famine. He understood what it meant to run from hell and find refuge. He wrote that Reinhard had worked his farm for 6 months, October 1945 through April 1946. He worked 6 days a week, dawn to dusk. He drove the tractor. He fixed fences. He helped repair the barn roof before winter came. He was polite. He was honest. He was, Joseph wrote, a good boy who got caught in a bad war. Joseph wrote that his family would sponsor Reinhard for immigration. They would guarantee employment. They would take full responsibility. He had already filed paperwork with his Member of Parliament. That letter sat in a file in Ottawa, along with 416 others just like it. On the other side sat another file, thicker, heavier, angrier. The Canadian Legion had held its annual meeting in Calgary in April 1946. The Legion represented Canadian veterans, men who had fought in both wars, men who had lost friends, brothers, sons, men who had seen the worst of what Germany could do. They passed a resolution with a vote of 847 to 23. The resolution was simple. No German prisoner of war shall be permitted to remain in Canada under any circumstances. None. Not one. Not ever. 15,843 veterans signed a petition supporting this resolution. They delivered it to Parliament in person. A delegation of men with grey hair and missing limbs and eyes that had seen too much. They said letting German prisoners stay would dishonour the 42,042 Canadian servicemen who died defeating Germany. They said it would spit on the graves of boys who never came home. They said it would betray everything the war had been fought for. Letters flooded newspapers across Canada. Most agreed with the Legion. One woman wrote to the Lethbridge Herald. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. She was 58 years old. Her son Thomas had died at Juno Beach on June 6, 1944. He was 23. He made it 30 yards up the beach before a German machine gun cut him down. She wrote, "My boy gave his life so these people couldn't set foot in Canada. Now you want to invite them to stay? This is betrayal of the highest order." Her letter received 273 responses supporting her position. But not everyone agreed. Robert Mackenzie was 34 years old. He had fought at Caen, at Falaise, at the Scheldt. He saw 3 friends die. He was wounded twice. He came home with a purple heart and nightmares that woke him screaming. He wrote to the Herald, "I fought them at Caen, lost men I loved like brothers. But these are boys, not Hitler. They were 10 when they joined Hitler Youth. It wasn't a choice. They didn't choose this war. Give them a chance." The Canadian Legion branch in Calgary expelled him for writing that letter. They called him a Nazi sympathizer. They said his membership was revoked. This was the second layer of stakes. 2 sides, both convinced they were right, both carrying the weight of war's cost. No middle ground, no compromise, just orders that said all prisoners would return, and 6,000 men who didn't want to go. Then came the third layer, the strategic, the political, the international. This wasn't just about 3 boys, or 12,000 prisoners, or even 35,000 Germans in Canada. This was about the Geneva Convention, about precedent, about the beginning of the Cold War, and what it meant to show mercy to yesterday's enemy, who might be tomorrow's ally. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was clear. Prisoners of war must be repatriated after hostilities end. Must be. No exceptions written in the text. The convention was designed to protect prisoners from indefinite detention, to ensure they went home, to prevent victor nations from keeping captive soldiers as slave labor forever. But in 1946, the convention created an impossible situation. The British government sent directives to all Commonwealth nations in March 1946. The language was unambiguous. All German prisoners in British, Canadian, Australian, South African, and New Zealand custody must be returned by August 31st, 1946. No exceptions regardless of local sentiment. The rationale was simple mathematics. Germany needed 2.1 million workers to begin reconstruction. The Allied powers held approximately 1.8 million German prisoners worldwide. America held 370,000. Britain held 400,000. France held 600,000. The Soviet Union held at least 400,000, maybe more. Nobody knew exact numbers from Stalin's camps. Canada held 35,000. Every prisoner living comfortably abroad was one less German hauling rubble in Hamburg, one less man mixing concrete in Munich, one less pair of hands rebuilding what the bombs destroyed. Britain needed Germany rebuilt, not for charity, for strategic necessity. The Soviet Union was already the new enemy. Churchill had given his Iron Curtain speech in Missouri in March 1946. The Cold War was beginning, even as the Hot War's ashes still smoldered. West Germany needed to become a functioning state, a buffer against Soviet expansion, an ally in the coming struggle. That meant workers, millions of them. That meant repatriation, all of them. But there was another consideration nobody said out loud, but everyone understood. Precedent. If Canada kept 6,000 German prisoners, what would happen? America held 370,000. Would they face similar requests? Would American farmers write letters? Would 50,000 German prisoners in Iowa and Texas and California decide they'd rather stay than return to ruins? Britain held 400,000 prisoners. Would they rebel if they saw Canada grant exceptions? Would they refuse to board ships? Would the whole system collapse? The men making these decisions sat in offices in London and Ottawa. They looked at maps and numbers and diplomatic considerations. They weighed options and made choices. They chose order over mercy, law over compassion, precedent over individual circumstances. On June 5, 1946, a telegram arrived from London. It was marked urgent. It was addressed to the Canadian Prime Minister. It said, "Geneva Convention Article 75 requires immediate repatriation upon cessation of hostilities. All German POWs in Commonwealth territories must return by 31st August 1946. No exceptions regardless of local sentiment." That telegram made its way down through bureaucracy, from the Prime Minister to the Minister of Defence, from defence to military command, from command to camp administrators, from administrators to Captain William Henderson's desk. That telegram was why Henderson sat across from 3 teenage boys and told them no. That telegram was the third layer of stakes: international law, strategic necessity, the machinery of government grinding forward, indifferent to individual suffering, focused only on bigger pictures painted in broader strokes. These were the 3 layers: personal devastation, community division, global politics. And against all that weight, 3 boys refused. But understanding the stakes means nothing without understanding the perspective of those enforcing them. The people tasked with saying no, the officials who believed they were right to refuse. Captain William Henderson was not a cruel man. He was 45 years old. He had grey hair and lines around his eyes. He had fought at the Somme when he was 15, lied about his age to enlist, saw friends die in ways no one should die. He came home with medals and nightmares. He worked as a schoolteacher for 20 years. Then the Second War came, and they needed men with military experience, so he put the uniform back on. He didn't run Camp 133 with cruelty. He followed the Geneva Convention strictly. Prisoners got 3 meals a day. They got clean barracks. They got medical care when sick. They got mail from home. They got work details that paid small wages. He treated them like human beings because that's what the law required and what his conscience demanded. He believed in order. He believed in following commands. He believed that without rules and regulations, the whole system would collapse into chaos. When prisoners came to his office asking to stay, he listened. He read their letters. He acknowledged their pain. Then he said no, because his orders said no. He slept well enough at night, believing he was doing his duty. But the 3 boys bothered him. He couldn't say exactly why. Maybe because they were so young. Maybe because they reminded him of himself at 15, desperate and scared, trying to survive a war that had no interest in sparing boys. He would think about them later, years later, long after the camp closed and the prisoners went home and the barracks were torn down. He would wonder what happened to them. He would hope they found something like peace. Lieutenant Colonel James MacLeod commanded Camp 133. He was 52 years old, tall, grey hair, thick moustache. He had joined the Canadian Army in 1914 and fought through the entire First World War. He stayed in after armistice, made it his career. He ran the camp with efficiency and fairness. 12,500 prisoners, 300 Canadian guards, minimal incidents, no escapes. By military standards, a success. He submitted a report to Ottawa in April 1946, The report noted that 187 prisoners had secured employment sponsors from local farmers. Work performance, excellent. Farmer testimonials described them as the best workers they'd ever had. He requested consideration for immigration exceptions. Ottawa responded. Request denied. London insists on full repatriation. MacLeod accepted this. He was a military man. Orders were orders. But privately, to Henderson over coffee, he admitted it seemed wasteful. Here were men willing to work, wanting to contribute, and Canada needed workers desperately. The post-war economy was booming. Labour was scarce. Immigration could help, but orders were orders. They would return, all of them. Across the Atlantic, in London, men in the Foreign Office and War Office made decisions based on information MacLeod would never see. A classified memo dated March 18, 1946, laid out the rationale clearly. Germany requires estimated 2.1 million workers for reconstruction. Current POW population abroad, 1.8 million. Every POW comfortable in Allied custody equals one fewer German rebuilding infrastructure. Strategic imperative, immediate return. Geneva Convention compliance essential. Precedent risk. If Canada retains 6,000, US and UK face similar demands from estimated 770,000 prisoners. System failure probable. Recommendation: enforce full repatriation, no exceptions. The memo was signed by 3 senior officials. They never met any prisoners. They never visited camps. They looked at numbers and made choices. One junior clerk in the Foreign Office wrote a dissenting memo. It was never officially filed. It was found decades later in archived papers. The clerk wrote, "These individuals were indoctrinated as children. Canadian re-education program demonstrably successful. Forcing return of rehabilitated youth may undermine future Allied-German relations. Suggest case-by-case evaluation." A senior official scrawled a response in red ink. Sentiment noted. Decision stands. Law is law. That was the British perspective. Legal, strategic, cold. But there was another British voice worth noting. Major Peter Thornton had been a prisoner of war himself. German Stalag, 1940 to 1945. 5 years behind wire. He was repatriated in May 1945, skeletal and sick, but alive. He wrote a letter to the Times in April 1946 after reading about the Canadian situation. He wrote, "I spent 5 years in German captivity. I was treated according to Geneva Convention standards most of the time. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. The guards were men doing their jobs, some cruel, some kind, mostly indifferent. War makes everyone a prisoner of circumstance. These boys asking to stay in Canada are not the same men who guarded me. They're children who got caught in the machine. Send them back if law requires, but don't pretend it's justice." The Times published his letter on page 7. 3 people wrote responses. 2 disagreed. 1 agreed. Then the conversation moved on because there were newer crises, fresher wounds, more immediate concerns. The Canadian perspective was split along predictable lines. Veterans largely opposed, farmers largely supported. Politicians tried to please both sides and pleased neither. The media published editorials on both sides. The public remained divided. The government chose the path of least resistance. Follow London's orders, enforce the law, send them all back, promise nothing, hope the situation resolved itself quietly. This was 30% of the story. The voices of those who said no. The machinery of government turning. The perspective that saw 3 boys as numbers in a system, problems to be processed, anomalies to be corrected. Understanding this perspective doesn't make it right, but it shows it wasn't simply cruelty. It was bureaucracy. It was law. It was men following orders they believed served a greater good. Right or wrong, this was the wall the 3 boys faced. Immovable, indifferent, absolute. Now you need to understand how 3 teenage boys ended up standing in Henderson's office in the first place. You need to go back to where this started, to the Hitler Youth, to the lies that shaped them, to the war that broke them, to the journey that brought them here. The story begins in different cities, but the pattern is the same. Reinhard Schroeder was 10 years old in 1938 when the Hitler Youth came to his school in Hamburg. They weren't asking, they were telling. Every German boy had to join, not a choice, a requirement, the law. Your parents couldn't refuse, you couldn't refuse. The entire nation's children would be molded into perfect soldiers for the Führer. Reinhard remembered the day. October, cold morning. The man wore a brown uniform with a red armband, swastika in a white circle. He stood at the front of the classroom while the teacher sat silent. The man said, "You are the future of Germany. You will be strong. You will be loyal. You will serve the fatherland." The next Saturday, Reinhard put on his new uniform. Brown shirt, black shorts, red armband matching the man's. He felt proud because everyone told him he should feel proud. The Hitler Youth was not like Boy Scouts. It was training for war. They learned to march in perfect lines, left foot, right foot, arms swinging in rhythm. They marched for hours until their legs ached and their feet bled in their boots. But they didn't complain because complaining was weakness. They learned to shoot, first air rifles at paper targets, then real rifles at targets shaped like enemy soldiers, British soldiers, French soldiers, Jewish caricatures drawn with exaggerated features. They learned to hit the center mass. They learned to reload quickly. They learned to clean the weapons until the metal shone. They learned songs. Every song was about dying for Germany. Every song glorified sacrifice. Every song ended with death described as beautiful, meaningful, the highest honor a German could achieve. Every meeting started the same way. The boys stood in rows. The leader called, "Heil Hitler!" They shot their right arms straight out, hand flat, fingers together. They shouted in unison, "Heil Hitler!" If your arm wasn't straight enough, you got hit with a stick. If you didn't shout loud enough, you ran laps until you vomited. They taught history, but it was lies dressed up as truth. They said Germany lost the First War because of traitors, because Jews stabbed the army in the back, because weak politicians surrendered when victory was certain. They said the Treaty of Versailles was a crime. They said Germany was owed revenge. They said other countries wanted to destroy Germany, that enemies surrounded them, that only strength would save them, that weakness invited destruction. They said the Jewish people were the enemy, that they controlled banks, that they poisoned German culture, that removing them was necessary for Germany's survival. They said Germans were better than everyone else, superior race, destined to rule. The rest of the world existed to serve German greatness or be crushed beneath it. Reinhard believed every word. He was 10 years old. His teachers said it. His parents didn't disagree. The radio said it every day. The newspapers printed it. The movies showed it. The entire world around him confirmed these truths. How could it not be true? Ewald Zimmermann in Munich learned the exact same things. Dieter Wagner in Dresden heard the same lies. Millions of boys across Germany absorbed the same poison and called it education. By the time they were 12, these boys could take apart a rifle and put it back together in under 2 minutes. They could read topographic maps. They could use a compass and find north without looking at the sun. They could recognize enemy tanks from their silhouettes at 300 meters. They knew which races the Nazis said were inferior and which were acceptable. They had stopped thinking for themselves. They just believed what they were told. The Hitler Youth camps felt like adventure. They hiked in the mountains, they competed in contests, they slept in tents and sang around campfires under stars. But every song was about war. Every game practiced killing. Every story ended with a German hero dying gloriously for the fatherland. The boys dreamed of the day they could be real soldiers. They thought war was glorious. They had no idea what it actually meant. That day came sooner than anyone expected. By late 1944, Germany was losing badly. The Americans had landed in France in June. They were pushing east. The Russians were pushing from the other direction, crushing German armies with numerical superiority and rage born from years of German atrocities. German cities were being bombed every night. The Luftwaffe barely existed anymore. The Kriegsmarine was sunk or hiding. The Wehrmacht was running out of men. So they started taking boys. In October 1944, Reinhard Schröder turned 16. A letter arrived at his house. Official, stamped with eagles, it said he was conscripted into the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth Division, an entire division made up of teenagers. 2 weeks later, he left Hamburg wearing a Wehrmacht uniform. His mother cried. His father shook his hand and told him to make Germany proud. Reinhard climbed onto a truck with 40 other teenage boys. None had been in real combat. Most had never left their hometowns. The war was nothing like the songs promised. The war came to Reinhard in December 1944. Belgium, the Ardennes forest. Snow falling so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Temperature dropped to 12 degrees below zero. The Battle of the Bulge, they would call it later, Hitler's last desperate gamble. Throw everything at the Americans, break through, reach Antwerp, change the war's momentum. It didn't work. Reinhard spent 4 months in that frozen hell. He dug foxholes in ground so hard his shovel bounced off the dirt. His hands went numb, his feet got frostbite. 3 days passed without a hot meal, just cold rations eaten with shaking fingers. Then the fighting started. Artillery shells screamed overhead and exploded in bursts of fire and frozen earth. Machine guns rattled without stopping. Officers screamed orders that made no sense. Boys died in the snow, crying for their mothers. Reinhard fired his rifle at shadows in the trees. He had no idea if he hit anyone. He just kept shooting because everyone around him was shooting. He lasted 4 months. On February 23, 1945, near the German town of Cleve, British forces attacked his position. Tanks rolled forward through the snow. Shells fell like rain. The sergeant leading Reinhard's unit was hit by shrapnel and fell screaming. The boy next to Reinhard dropped his rifle and ran. Reinhard wanted to run too, but there was nowhere to go. A British soldier appeared around the corner of a destroyed building, young, maybe 20. He pointed his rifle at Reinhard's chest. Reinhard dropped his weapon and raised his hands. 40 other teenage soldiers did the same. They were boys pretending to be warriors, and they had lost. Ewald Zimmermann was captured 3 weeks later. March 15, 1945. Americans crossing the Rhine River. Same story, different place. Different uniforms, same ending. Hands up. War over. Prisoner. Dieter Wagner surrendered on May 2, 1945, in northern Germany. The war ended 5 days later. 7 days after his surrender, they told him Hitler was dead. Shot himself in a bunker while Berlin burned. Dieter felt nothing. Just empty. All 3 boys became prisoners. The British processed them through temporary camps in Europe, checked their names against lists, looked for SS tattoos, asked questions about war crimes. Found nothing because these were just boys, children in uniforms. No crimes except being born German at the wrong time. Britain had too many prisoners, not enough space, not enough food, not enough guards. So they put them on ships. The ships crossed the Atlantic to Canada. Reinhard arrived in Halifax in June 1945, tired, scared, convinced he would be tortured or killed because Nazi propaganda had taught him that prisoners were treated terribly, that enemies had no mercy, that capture meant death or worse. Canadian guards loaded them onto trains. The trains rolled west for days, across endless forests and prairies that stretched to horizons so far away they seemed impossible. The boys pressed their faces against windows and saw a country so big it made Germany look like a garden plot. Finally, they arrived in southern Alberta, hot, dry, nothing like home. Guards marched them through gates topped with barbed wire. This was Camp 133. This was where they would spend the next year of their lives. None of the 3 boys could have guessed what would happen next. They expected punishment. They expected cruelty. They expected everything their years of Nazi indoctrination had promised about enemies. What they got instead changed them forever. The moment that broke them came in August 1945. Camp authorities announced that all prisoners would attend a mandatory screening. No exceptions. Everyone assembled in the camp theatre, a low building with wooden benches and a white screen hanging from the front wall. The boys filed in with 12,000 others. They sat. They waited. Guards stood along the walls. Nobody spoke. The air was hot and still, smelled like sweat and dust and something electric, something tense. A projector flickered to life. The screen showed footage from liberated concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz, names that would become synonyms for hell. The images came one after another like punches, piles of corpses, hundreds of bodies stacked like firewood, skeletons with skin stretched over bones so thin you could see every ridge, every hollow. Survivors who looked more dead than alive. Eyes that had seen too much to ever close peacefully again. The camera moved through barracks, showed triple-decker bunks where 5 people slept in a space meant for 1. Showed latrines that were just trenches filled with waste. Showed yards where prisoners stood for roll call in the snow for hours, while guards beat anyone who moved. Then the ovens. Huge industrial furnaces for burning corpses. The camera lingered, showed the mechanisms, showed how efficiently they worked, showed ash piles 10 feet high, showed bones that hadn't burned completely. The narrator spoke in English. A Canadian officer translated into German over a loudspeaker. This is Bergen-Belsen. British forces liberated this camp in April 1945. 60,000 prisoners were still alive. 13,000 died in the weeks after liberation because they were too far gone to save. The screen showed more camps, more bodies, more survivors. The numbers kept coming. 6 million Jews murdered, systematically, methodically, with German efficiency applied to genocide. Reinhard Schroeder felt his stomach turn. He tried to look away, couldn't. The images burned into his eyes, into his brain, into some place deeper than thought. He stood up, stumbled down the row of benches, pushed past other prisoners, made it outside, bent over behind the building, vomited into the dirt. His whole body shook. He vomited until there was nothing left, then dry heaved, then collapsed against the wooden wall and slid down to sit in the dust. Inside, Ewald Zimmermann sat frozen. Tears ran down his face. He didn't wipe them away, didn't move, just stared at the screen while his world broke apart and reformed into something unrecognizable. Dieter Wagner made a small choking sound, covered his eyes with his hands, but he could still see it through his fingers, could still hear the narrator, could still understand what his country had done. The screening lasted 90 minutes. When the lights came back on, the theatre was silent. 12,000 men sat in absolute quiet. Some cried, some looked sick, some looked angry, some looked like they'd been hollowed out and nothing remained inside. The hardcore Nazis whispered that it was lies, Allied propaganda, fake footage designed to make them feel guilty. They said it loud enough for others to hear, tried to maintain the faith, tried to keep believing. But most of the prisoners knew, deep down where truth lives and lies cannot reach, they knew. Corporal David Thompson was 28 years old, a Canadian guard. He stood along the back wall during the screening and watched the prisoners' faces instead of the screen. He'd already seen this footage, multiple times, didn't need to see it again. That night, he wrote in his journal. The entry was later found in archives. August 12, 1945. Showed the camp's footage today. Watched the Germans watch. Many cried. Some shouted it was lies, but even they looked shaken. The young ones took it hardest. Saw one boy run outside, heard him getting sick. Another just sat frozen with tears streaming. They're processing something that breaks their whole world. Everything they believed, everything they were taught, all of it built on mountains of corpses. You could see it happening in their eyes, something breaking, something dying, maybe something being born too, but born in pain. That night, Reinhard Schroeder went back to his barracks, climbed onto his bunk, reached into his boot where he'd hidden a small photograph. Adolf Hitler. Stern face, hard eyes. The man they'd worshipped, the man they'd died for, the man who promised glory and delivered ash. Reinhard stared at that photograph for a long time, remembered being 10 years old, shouting, "Heil Hitler!" with all the faith a child could hold. Remembered believing every word. Remembered thinking he was saving the world. He tore the photograph into pieces, small pieces, tiny fragments, kept tearing until nothing remained but confetti. Then he walked to the garbage bin and threw it away. Ewald Zimmermann stopped giving the Nazi salute. He'd been doing it automatically when talking to older German prisoners. Habit, conditioning, 8 years of reflex. He stopped. Dieter Wagner had asked about his Hitler Youth dagger every week since arriving. They'd confiscated it during processing. It had his name engraved on it, a prize for being excellent in training. He wanted it back. He stopped asking. All 3 boys felt the same crushing emptiness. If everything they'd believed was false, what was true? If the heroes were monsters, what did that make them? If the great cause was genocide, what were they? They were not heroes. They were not soldiers. They were children who had been lied to, used, manipulated, made into accessories to evil. The shame was overwhelming, but beneath the shame was something else, something unexpected. Relief. Relief that they'd been captured. Relief that they'd survived. Relief that they were here behind Canadian wire, where they couldn't hurt anyone anymore, where the war couldn't make them into monsters. Camp 133 had hardcore Nazis. Every camp did. Men who still believed. Men who would believe until they died, because admitting the truth meant admitting their lives had been wasted on a lie too big to face. Hauptmann Otto Krebs was 34 years old, former SS officer. He'd been captured in France in 1944. He ran things among the German prisoners, created his own hierarchy, enforced his own rules. After the screening, he called the believers together, told them it was propaganda, told them to stay strong, told them the real Germans would never accept Allied lies. He saw Reinhard, Ewald, and Dieter afterward, saw how they'd changed, saw the doubt in their eyes, the rejection of faith. Verräter, he spat, traitors. He told them real Germans would be proud to return home and rebuild the fatherland. Staying in an enemy country was shameful, cowardly, treasonous. Other prisoners heard. 2 men had been murdered at different camps for betraying Germany. Everyone knew those stories. The threat was clear. But the 3 boys didn't care anymore. You can only threaten someone who has something to lose. They'd already lost everything. Their country was ash. Their beliefs were lies. Their futures were void. What else could anyone take from them? October 1945. Camp authorities announced that low-risk prisoners could work outside the camp. Local farmers needed help with harvest. The government would pay prisoners 20 cents per day. It wasn't much, but it was payment. Recognition that their work had value, that they were something more than enemies behind wire. Reinhard volunteered immediately. Anything to get outside the barbed wire, even for a few hours, even to work until his back ached and his hands bled. They assigned him to Joseph Kowalski's farm, 7 miles west of Lethbridge. A truck dropped Reinhard at the farm gate on a cold October morning. The sun was just coming up. The sky was that particular shade of pink that only happens at dawn on the prairie. Frost covered the grass. His breath made clouds in the air. Joseph Kowalski walked out to meet him. 55 years old, thick arms, weathered face, hands that had worked soil for decades. He wore overalls and a flannel shirt, boots covered in mud. He looked Reinhard up and down, saw a 17-year-old boy in a faded German uniform, thin, uncertain, eyes that had seen too much. Joseph smiled. "You are just a boy," he said in accented English. "Come, we eat first." He turned and walked toward the farmhouse. Reinhard followed, uncertain. The kitchen smelled like fresh bread and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute they got in camp. The smell alone made Reinhard's mouth water. Anna Kowalski stood at the stove. She was a small woman with grey hair pulled back in a bun. She wore an apron over a simple dress. When she turned and saw the German uniform, she froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Anna pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. "Sit," she said. Her English was better than Joseph's. "You must be hungry." They gave him eggs, real eggs fried in butter, thick slices of bread with jam, a glass of cold milk. More food than he'd seen in 6 months. Reinhard ate slowly, waited for them to take it away, for the trick to be revealed, for the punishment to begin. It never came. When he finished, Joseph handed him a cup of coffee and explained the day's work. No yelling, no threats, just simple instructions delivered like one farmer to another. Reinhard worked that farm 6 days a week, through fall and into winter. October, November, December, January, February, March, April. He drove the tractor through fields that stretched to horizons so wide they made him dizzy. He fixed fences, digging post holes in frozen ground until his shoulders screamed. He helped Joseph repair the barn roof before the first snow came. They worked side by side in cold wind that cut through their jackets. Every day at noon, Anna made lunch, sandwiches, soup, sometimes stew with vegetables and chunks of beef. Every day they ate together at the family table. Anna, Joseph, their daughter Margaret, and Reinhard. Like he belonged there, like he was family. Margaret was 14 years old, dark braids, bright eyes. She was curious about everything. She'd never met a German before, never met anyone who'd been in the war. She practiced her school English with Reinhard, taught him new words, corrected his pronunciation gently when he made mistakes, laughed when he got confused by idioms that made no sense. "It's raining cats and dogs," she said one afternoon, looking out at a downpour. Reinhard looked at her in confusion. "But I see water, no cats, no dogs." She laughed, not mean, just delighted. "It's an expression. It means it's raining hard." "English is strange language," Reinhard said. "German is strange too," Margaret countered. "You have words that are 3 words stuck together." They became friends, careful friends, across the distance of age and history and war, but friends nonetheless. At the end of each day, Joseph paid him 4 Canadian coins that added up to 20 cents. It was almost nothing, but it meant everything. Joseph was paying him like a worker, not treating him like property, not treating him like a prisoner, like a person whose labor had value, whose effort deserved recognition. One day in December, after they'd finished work and were walking back to the house, Joseph stopped, turned to Reinhard, spoke quietly. "You are just a boy. This war was not your fault. You were a child when they lied to you." Reinhard tried to speak, couldn't. His throat closed, his eyes burned. Joseph put a hand on his shoulder, squeezed once, then walked toward the house. Reinhard stood in the December cold until he could breathe again. That night, back in his barracks, he lay in his bunk and cried for the first time since capture. Not from despair, from something else. Something he didn't have words for in German or English. Something that felt like hope. Ewald Zimmermann found his transformation in a different place. November 1945, camp authorities announced that prisoners could take university classes by mail. The University of Saskatchewan would provide textbooks and grade assignments. Prisoners could study engineering, mathematics, languages, anything they wanted. Ewald signed up immediately. Before the war, he dreamed of becoming an engineer. His father had been a mechanic in Munich. Ewald grew up watching him fix things, learned to love the logic of machines, the way parts fit together, the satisfaction of making something broken work again. The Hitler Youth had channeled that love into weapons maintenance, tank mechanics, artillery repair, military applications. But the underlying fascination remained. Now he could study properly. They gave him real textbooks, heavy books with hundreds of pages about physics and mathematics and engineering principles. The camp set aside a heated room for studying. Tables, chairs, decent light. Ewald spent every free hour there, worked through equations, drew diagrams, taught himself things he'd never learned in school because school had stopped teaching real subjects after 1933 and started teaching Nazi ideology instead. His first exam came back in January 1946. He opened the envelope with shaking hands. 92%. At the top, the professor had written in neat handwriting, "Excellent work. You demonstrate real aptitude. Keep going." Ewald stared at those words for 10 minutes, read them over and over. Someone believed in him. Someone thought he had a future worth developing. Someone saw past the uniform and the accent and the fact that he'd fought for the wrong side. Saw potential instead of just guilt. In Germany, former Hitler youth soldiers had no future. The stigma followed them everywhere. No schools, no jobs, no opportunities, just suspicion and shame. Here, a professor at a Canadian university was encouraging him, grading his work fairly, treating him like a student, like a human being who could still become something. Ewald applied himself with fierce dedication, finished assignments weeks early, asked for extra problems, requested more advanced material. His grades climbed, 88, 92, 95. A letter arrived from a factory owner in Lethbridge. He'd heard about the university program. He wrote that if Ewald could stay in Canada, he would hire him as an apprentice engineer, give him real work, pay real wages, teach him practical applications. That letter joined the stack of documents Ewald would present to Lieutenant Colonel MacLeod. Evidence that he could contribute, that he had value, that he deserved a chance. Dieter Wagner discovered something unexpected in the least likely place. Camp 133 had an orchestra. 30 German prisoners who had been professional musicians before the war, violinists, cellists, pianists, a conductor who had led symphonies in Berlin before everything fell apart. They practiced twice a week in the camp theatre, the same theatre where they'd watched the Holocaust footage. But now it filled with music instead of horror, Bach instead of ashes. One day in January 1946, Dieter walked past during rehearsal, heard violin music drifting through the door. It was Beethoven, a piece his mother used to play. He stopped, listened, felt something in his chest crack open. Dieter had studied violin since he was 6 years old. Both his parents were music teachers. They'd given him a beautiful instrument for his 10th birthday, spent months saving for it. He'd practiced every day, dreamed of playing professionally, of being good enough for the Dresden Conservatory. Then the war came. Then the bombs fell. Then everything burned. He hadn't touched a violin since being conscripted, thought that part of his life was dead, gone like his father, destroyed like his city. But hearing that music awakened something he'd thought buried beyond resurrection. He asked the orchestra leader if he could join. The man was 60 years old, grey beard, kind eyes. He handed Dieter a violin and sheet music. "Show me what you can do." Dieter played. His fingers remembered what his mind had forgotten, muscle memory deeper than thought. The music poured out of him. 3 minutes where he was not a prisoner, not a former soldier, not German or enemy or anything except a boy playing violin. When he finished, the orchestra leader nodded. "You can join." They practiced Bach and Mozart and Brahms. They played for other prisoners, made the barracks feel less like cages and more like spaces where beauty could still exist. The camp commandant allowed them to perform concerts for people from Lethbridge, civilians, Canadians, people whose sons had died fighting Germans. The first concert was in February 1946. Dieter was terrified. What if someone attacked them? What if the audience threw things? What if they were reminded that music couldn't absolve complicity? But the auditorium filled. 100 people, old and young, veterans and farmers, wives and mothers and children. The orchestra played. Dieter's fingers moved across the strings. The music filled the space, transcended language, transcended nationality, just became sound and emotion and the universal language that exists before words. After the concert, an older woman approached Dieter. She had white hair and lines around her eyes. She wore a simple dress and a coat that had been mended several times. "Excuse me," she said softly. Dieter turned, saw her kind face, waited. "My son died at Normandy," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. No anger, just statement of fact. June 6th, 1944. He was 23 years old. Dieter's stomach twisted. He wanted to run, to apologize, to say something that could matter. But what words exist for that? What could he possibly say? The woman continued, "I came tonight because music belongs to everyone, not just one country, not just one people. You played beautifully. Thank you." She smiled, small, sad, real. Then she turned and walked away. Dieter stood frozen. This woman had lost her son to German bullets, lost him on a beach while men like Dieter's commanding officers tried to kill as many Americans as possible. And she came to hear Germans play violin, and she thanked him. The grace of it was too large to understand, too profound to process. It didn't erase anything, didn't absolve anything. But it showed something Dieter had never imagined possible, that mercy could exist between enemies, that humanity could survive hate, that maybe, just maybe, redemption was not completely impossible. By March 1946, whispers started about repatriation. Prisoners talked in low voices, speculated about when, about how, about what waited on the other side. The Lethbridge Herald printed articles, editorials on both sides, letters from readers. The community was divided. One article supported allowing prisoners to stay, talked about labor shortages, about the 417 farmers who vouched for their German workers, about economic needs and practical considerations. 3 articles opposed, written by veterans, by widows, by people who had lost too much to forgive too soon. Mary Donaldson wrote about her husband, who died at Dieppe in 1942, called the idea of letting Germans stay an obscenity, a betrayal, said her husband's grave would weep. The Canadian Legion held a meeting in Calgary, passed a resolution, 847 to 23. No German prisoners should remain, period, no exceptions. Robert Mackenzie was one of the 23 who voted no. He was 34, had fought at Caen, lost 3 friends, came home with wounds visible and invisible. He wrote a letter explaining his vote, published in the Herald, said these were children who'd been indoctrinated, said they didn't choose the war, said mercy was not betrayal. The Legion expelled him, called him a Nazi sympathizer, revoked his membership. Inside Camp 133, the 3 boys watched this debate from behind wire. They had no voice, no vote, just hope that somehow, impossibly, things would work out. On a cold afternoon in March, Reinhard, Ewald, and Dieter met during Sunday recreation time. They sat on a bench near the fence, watching snow melt in weak sunlight. Reinhard spoke first. "I do not want to go back to Germany." His voice was quiet, but firm, certain. Ewald nodded. "Dresden is Soviet zone. I cannot return. Munich is rubble. What future exists there?" Dieter looked at his hands. "My father is dead. My mother has nothing. If I return, I am just another mouth she cannot feed." They sat in silence, thinking, weighing options that didn't exist. Then Reinhard said what they were all thinking. "What if we try to stay here?" It sounded crazy. They were enemy soldiers. They were prisoners. They had no rights, no leverage, no power. But they had tasted something in Canada they had never known in Germany. Reinhard had experienced kindness from people who should hate him, had been paid for his work, treated like family, shown what normal life could be. Ewald had been given education and opportunity, had been told he had potential, that his future mattered. Dieter had found grace from a woman who had every right to curse him, had been allowed to make beauty instead of destruction. "When they try to send us back," Ewald said slowly, "we refuse. We asked to stay. Dieter added. We fight, Reinhard finished. They made a pact that afternoon, shook hands, spoke it in German like an oath. Wir bleiben hier. We stay here, no matter what. None of them knew if it was possible, but for the first time since the war started, they had something worth fighting for. Not territory, not ideology, not glory. Just the chance to become something other than what the war had made them. The chance to build instead of destroy, to create instead of kill. The chance to be human again. May 3rd, 1946. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 3 boys stood outside Lieutenant Colonel MacLeod's office. Reinhard held Joseph Kowalski's letter folded in his hand. The paper was worn soft from being read and reread. Ewald clutched his university transcripts against his chest. Dieter carried a single sheet, signed by the Lethbridge Symphony conductor. These were their weapons, paper and ink, evidence that they had value, that they deserved a chance. A guard opened the door, gestured them inside. MacLeod sat behind his desk, 52 years old, grey hair, thick moustache, eyes that had seen too much war to be surprised by anything. A translator stood beside him, a young corporal who spoke fluent German. The boys entered, stood in a line, waited. MacLeod looked at them, saw what Henderson had seen. Not monsters, just children trying to survive circumstances beyond their control. Reinhard spoke first, in German. The translator repeated the words in English. Sir, we want to stay in Canada. We do not wish to return to Germany. We have sponsors. We have work. Please let us stay. He placed Joseph's letter on the desk. 2 pages, handwritten, careful English. Reinhard Schroeder worked my farm 6 months. Best worker I've had. My family sponsors him for immigration. I take full responsibility. My member of parliament has filed formal request. Ewald added his transcripts. 3 pages of grades and professor comments. Mathematics, 88. Physics, 92. Engineering principles, 95. Professor Hutchinson had written, Mr. Zimmerman shows exceptional promise. With proper education he could contribute significantly to Canadian engineering. A factory owner's letter was attached, offering employment, offering sponsorship, offering a future. Dieter's contribution was simpler. 1 page from the symphony conductor, signed by 3 other musicians. Dieter Wagner plays violin beautifully, would welcome him as member if he could remain. MacLeod read each document, took his time. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence. Finally, he looked up. His face was kind but firm, the face of a man who has to deliver bad news and knows it. Boys, he waited for the translation. I understand what you're asking. I can see you've worked hard. I can see people have spoken well of you. Pause. The translator caught up. But this decision is not mine. The British government has ordered all prisoners returned. Canada has agreed. The law requires repatriation. Another pause, longer this time. You will be on the June 15th transport. The words fell like stones into deep water, sinking, irretrievable. Reinhard felt the floor shift beneath him. Ewald's face went blank. Dieter made a small sound in his throat. I am truly sorry, MacLeod added. I wish there was more I could do. But there wasn't. Orders were orders. Law was law. The machinery of government had made its decision, and 3 boys with paper weapons could not stop it. They left his office in silence, walked across the compound, didn't speak. What was there to say? But they didn't give up. May 8th, Joseph Kowalski drove to Ottawa, 800 miles, 2 days of driving in his old truck. He went straight to Parliament Hill, found his Member of Parliament's office. The MP was a decent man, represented a rural riding, understood farmers, listened to constituents. Joseph explained about Reinhard, about the work, about the boy who'd become almost like family, about the future that could exist if the government would just allow one exception, just one. The MP listened, nodded, took notes, said he would look into it. He did. He filed an inquiry, received a response 2 weeks later from the Department of Immigration, brief, formal, final. All prisoner repatriation must comply with Geneva Convention requirements and British government directives. No exceptions will be considered at this time. The MP sent Joseph a letter explaining, apologising, saying his hands were tied. May 15th. 417 farmers across southern Alberta signed a petition. They brought it to Lethbridge, delivered it to the local MP's office. The paper was 8 feet long when unfolded, name after signature. Each farmer vouched for specific prisoners, listed their names, described their work, offered employment and sponsorship. The petition travelled to Ottawa, was read, was noted, was filed away. May 22nd. The Canadian Legion delivered their counter-petition, 15,843 signatures, from veterans across Canada, from men who had fought, from families who had lost sons. Their message was simple and absolute. No German prisoners should remain, not one, not ever. The weight of numbers favoured them. The weight of sacrifice favoured them. The weight of political calculation favoured them. Politicians did the math. 15,000 angry veterans versus 400 farmers. The choice was easy. May 28th. Joseph came to Camp 133 one final time. Regulations didn't allow civilians inside the compound. He stood outside the fence. Barbed wire between him and the boy who'd worked his farm for 6 months. Reinhardt walked across the yard. Other prisoners watched. Guards watched. Everyone knew what this was. Goodbye. Joseph reached his hand through the wire. Thick fingers, calloused palms, a working man's hands. Reinhardt gripped them, felt the strength, the warmth, the human connection that had shown him what kindness looked like. "You worked hard for me," Joseph said, his English slow, deliberate, making sure Reinhardt understood every word. "You are a good boy. Not your fault what happened." Pause. The prairie wind blew dust across the compound. "When things get better, you come back. We sponsor you. You have a home here." Reinhardt tried to speak, his throat closed. Tears ran down his face. He nodded, squeezed Joseph's hand once more, then let go, turned, walked away before he completely broke down. Joseph stood at the fence watching until Reinhardt disappeared into a barracks. Then he got in his truck and drove home. Anna asked how it went. He shook his head, couldn't find words. That night at dinner, Margaret asked if Reinhardt would be okay. "I don't know," Joseph said. "I hope so. I pray so." June 8th, 1946. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. MacLeod called the 3 boys back to his office. They came with a flicker of hope. Maybe things had changed. Maybe the petitions worked. Maybe impossible happened. MacLeod's face told them everything before he spoke. Final answer from Ottawa. Wait for translation. All prisoners will be repatriated as scheduled. No exceptions. Pause. Let it sink in. You 3 will board transport June 15th to Halifax. From there, ship to Britain, then Germany. Longer pause. He saw their faces, saw hope die. "I am truly sorry, boys. I wish there was more I could do." Reinhardt felt like someone had punched his chest, couldn't breathe properly, grabbed the edge of MacLeod's desk to stay standing. Evold stared straight ahead, face blank, processing, accepting, dying inside. Dieter made a small choking sound, covered his mouth with his hand, turned and left the office. Reinhardt and Evold followed. They walked to their barracks, didn't speak. What words existed for this? What could be said that would matter? The night of June 13th, 3 days before departure. The barracks were quiet. Men packed their few belongings into canvas bags, wrote last letters, said quiet goodbyes. Dieter took out his violin, the one the orchestra had lent him. He'd have to return it tomorrow. This was his last night. He played a German folk song. His mother had taught it to him when he was 6, before the war, before everything broke. A simple melody about spring and flowers and hope. The music filled the barracks, slow, mournful. Beautiful in the way that sad things can be beautiful when they're true. Every prisoner stopped what they were doing, listened. Some had tears in their eyes. Some just stared at nothing. Some closed their eyes and remembered home before it became ruins. Dieter played for 20 minutes, poured everything into it, all the grief, all the fear, all the impossible hope that somehow this would end differently. When he finished, the barracks stayed silent. Then, slowly, men went back to packing, back to preparing, back to accepting the inevitable. June 15th, 1946, 6 in the morning. Dawn broke clear and cold over Camp 133. Guards called morning roll call, then called names from a list. Schroeder, Reinhard, Zimmermann, Ewald, Wagner, Dieter. 300 names total, all scheduled for this transport, the first of many. 10,000 men would leave over the next 2 months, back to Germany, back to whatever waited there. The boys lined up with their bags, canvas sacks containing everything they owned, a change of clothes, a few letters, small things, nothing valuable, nothing that mattered. Guards marched them to waiting trucks, army trucks with canvas covers. They climbed in, sat on wooden benches. The trucks started, engines coughing to life, then rolling forward, through the gates, past the barbed wire, out onto the prairie road. Reinhard looked back, saw the camp shrinking behind them, saw the guard towers, saw the place where he'd learned what kindness meant, saw it disappear. The trucks drove to Lethbridge train station. A long train waited, old passenger cars with wooden seats. Guards directed prisoners into the cars, 50 men to each one. Reinhard, Ewald and Dieter stayed together, found seats near a window, pressed their faces against the glass as the train pulled away. Lethbridge disappeared, the farm where Reinhard had worked, the university where Ewald had studied, the theatre where Dieter had played, all of it sliding past, going, gone. The train rolled east for 4 days, across the endless prairie, through wheat fields turning gold in early summer sun, past small towns with grain elevators rising like cathedrals, through forests so thick the darkness between trees looked solid. This was Canada, the country they'd learned to love, passing by outside the window, 1 mile at a time, each mile taking them further from the only place that had ever felt like home. Most prisoners talked about return, about seeing families, about rebuilding, about the future. They convinced themselves it would be okay, that Germany would recover, that life would normalize. Reinhard, Ewald, and Dieter stayed quiet. They knew better. They'd seen the letters, read about the destruction, understood what waited. 4 days. The train crossed a continent, arrived in Halifax on June 19th. Guards marched them onto a ship, the RMS Mauritania, a huge ocean liner converted to carry troops and prisoners. They went below deck, into sleeping areas packed with bunks stacked 3 high. The air smelled like oil and salt water and too many men in too small a space. The ship's engines rumbled, deep vibrations that shook the steel walls, then movement, slow at first, then steady, pulling away from the dock, out into the harbour, into the Atlantic. The crossing took 6 days, grey water under grey sky, waves that rolled endlessly toward horizons that never got closer. The ship rose and fell, rose and fell. The rhythm of it became background to everything. Reinhard got seasick the first 2 days, couldn't keep food down, lay in his bunk wishing for solid ground, wishing for the prairie, wishing for anything but this. Ewald spent hours on deck when they were allowed up, watched waves, thought about what waited in Germany, tried to prepare himself. Couldn't. Dieter found a quiet corner below deck, read his engineering textbook one more time, memorized equations he'd never use, clung to knowledge like a life raft in a storm. June 27th. The ship reached Britain, Portsmouth. Guards processed them through a temporary camp, checked names against lists, sorted by region of origin. More trains, more waiting, more processing. Finally, on July 3rd, 1946, they crossed into Germany. The train stopped at Hamburg station. Reinhard looked out the window. The station was missing half its roof. Twisted metal beams pointed at the sky like broken fingers. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel scars. He stepped down onto the platform. His mother stood there. Gertrude, 52 years old. She looked 70, thin, so thin. Her coat hung on her frame like it was draped over a skeleton. Her face was all angles and shadows. She saw him. Her eyes widened. She moved forward. They embraced. She felt like bones wrapped in cloth, fragile, breakable. He was afraid to squeeze too hard. "Reinhard," she whispered, "you're home." He looked past her. At Hamburg, the city he'd grown up in no longer existed. 74% destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were just flat spaces filled with rubble. Brick dust covered everything. Buildings stood like broken teeth, walls remaining but nothing inside except air and ashes. They walked through streets Reinhard remembered. The bakery where his mother bought bread was gone. The school where he'd learned to read was a pile of stones. The park where he'd played as a child was a crater filled with stagnant water. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin, exhausted, eyes empty. They pushed carts loaded with salvaged items. They dug through rubble, looking for anything useful. They stood in lines that stretched for blocks, waiting for ration distributions that never provided enough. His mother lived in a basement, part of a building that still stood, barely. 7 people shared 3 rooms, no windows, no heat except what they could burn in a metal drum. The smoke made everyone cough. That night, Reinhard lay on a thin mattress on a concrete floor. Above him, through gaps in the floor joists, he could see the stars. The building was so damaged that the roof didn't really exist anymore. He thought about Joseph's farm, the warm kitchen, Hannah's cooking, Margaret's laugh, the clean barracks at Camp 133, the feeling of being valued, being safe. He closed his eyes and promised himself this was temporary. Somehow, impossibly, he would find a way back. Ewald reached Munich to discover he couldn't get to Dresden. The Soviet zone was closed. Germans couldn't travel freely between occupation zones. His mother might be in Dresden, might be somewhere else. He had no way to know. He ended up in a refugee camp on the edge of Munich. A field of tents, 20 people per tent, lines for everything, food, water, the latrine that was just a trench in the ground. He showed someone his University of Saskatchewan certificates. The man laughed. "Mathematics? Engineering? Nobody needs that. We need bread. We need roofs. We need miracles." Ewald folded the certificates back into his bag. They'd meant everything in Canada. Here they were worthless paper. Dieter reached Dresden. The city was gone. Not damaged, not destroyed. Gone. Erased. 75% of the structures had been obliterated by the firebombing of February 1945. Block after block of ruins. The famous Frauenkirche was a pile of stones. The conservatory where his father taught was ash. The apartment where he grew up was a vacant lot. His mother lived in a building that still had 3 walls. The 4th wall was missing. They'd hung blankets to keep out wind and rain. Didn't work well. She was 51, but looked ancient. One eye gone, covered with a patch. She worked 12 hours a day in a Soviet-run factory making boots. Earned enough to buy thin soup and sleep in a dormitory. She embraced Dieter when he arrived, held him, cried. "Your father died," she said. "Soviet prison camp, November 1945. Dieter already knew. The Red Cross had sent notification, but hearing her say it made it real in a different way. That night, he asked if she still had his violin, the beautiful one they'd given him for his 10th birthday. She shook her head. It burned. Everything burned. He nodded, expected that, but it still hurt. 1946 became 1947. Months passed like prison sentences. Reinhard cleared rubble in Hamburg for 2 Deutsche Marks per day, enough to buy 1 loaf of black bread. He was always hungry. Ewald couldn't find work. Former Hitler youth were marked, watched. Nobody wanted to hire them. He lived in the refugee camp and slowly went hollow inside. Dieter tried to work, tried to function, couldn't. Started drinking whatever he could find, cheap schnapps, industrial alcohol mixed with water. Anything to stop thinking, stop remembering, stop comparing what he'd had in Canada to what he'd lost. 1947 became 1948, and then something changed. In April 1948, the Canadian government quietly announced a policy shift. Immigration Minister Paul Martin issued a directive. Former German prisoners of war could apply for Canadian immigration through standard channels. There were requirements: Canadian sponsor, employment verification, medical clearance, $500 deposit. But it was possible. The door had opened. The rationale was simple. Canada needed workers. 500,000 workers to support post-war economic expansion. Former prisoners had demonstrated work ethic and successful rehabilitation. They'd been processed, vetted, known quantities. And the Cold War was beginning. West Germany was becoming an ally. Showing mercy to former prisoners was good politics. Proof that democracy worked, that redemption was possible. About 1,100 former prisoners eventually applied. About 1,000 were accepted. In Hamburg, Reinhard heard about the policy change in June 1948. He applied immediately, filled out every form, collected every document. Joseph Kowalski sent an affidavit, promise of employment, promise of housing, taking full responsibility. Joseph also sent $300, a fortune, probably took him months to save. The letter said, "For your deposit and travel. Come home, son." Reinhard cried when he read it, applied for immigration, waited. March 1949, the approval letter arrived. Simple, official, beautiful. Application accepted. Report to Hamburg port for transport. Reinhard was 20 years old. He packed his few belongings, said goodbye to his mother, promised to send money when he could, promised to sponsor her if possible, promised to remember. She held him, whispered, "Be good, be happy, live." He boarded a ship in April 1949, crossed the Atlantic again, this time as an immigrant, not a prisoner, this time heading towards something, instead of away from it. The train from Halifax to Lethbridge took 4 days. He watched the prairie roll past and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Joy. The train stopped in Lethbridge. Reinhard stepped down onto the platform, looked around. Joseph Kowalski stood there, older, greyer, but the same kind eyes, the same strong hands. Joseph smiled, walked forward, held out his hand. Reinhard shook it. Joseph pulled him into a hug. "Welcome home, son." 1950. Ewald heard about the immigration policy, applied, had to wait for his paperwork, had to find a sponsor. The Lethbridge factory owner who'd written the letter in 1946 still remembered him, sent a new letter, sent deposit money, sent hope. May 1951. Approval came. Ewald was 21 years old. He left Germany without looking back. Nothing remained there for him. No family he could reach, no future he could imagine. Just ghosts and rubble and memories he wanted to forget. He arrived in Canada in June 1951, went to Lethbridge, worked at the factory for a year, saved money, applied to University of Alberta in Edmonton, got accepted, finished his engineering degree in 1955, top of his class, married a Canadian girl named Linda Morrison, had 3 children, built bridges across Alberta and Saskatchewan, became the person he dreamed of being before the war destroyed dreams. In 1961, he became a Canadian citizen, took the oath seriously, meant every word. But Dieter never applied. He stayed in Dresden, stayed in the Soviet zone, couldn't find the energy to try, couldn't find the will to hope. He drank to forget, drank to sleep, drank to stop seeing the comparison between what Canada had offered and what Germany had become. He never played violin again, couldn't bear to. Music reminded him of everything he'd lost. His mother tried to help. Couldn't. Watched her son disappear into alcohol and despair and self-destruction. May 1958. Dieter Wagner died. Liver failure. He was 28 years old. Before he died, he told his sister something she never forgot. "The happiest I ever was," he whispered, "was playing violin in Canada. I should have found a way back. I gave up. That was my mistake." They buried him in a Dresden cemetery, small grave marker. His mother visited every week until she died in 1967. When she died, she left instructions. Donate Dieter's violin to the Dresden Music School. It was the one thing she'd saved from the ruins, the only piece of his childhood that survived. She wrote a note to attach. "This belonged to my son, who found beauty in Canada but could not find his way back. May another child make music with it." Spring 1967, 21 years after repatriation. Reinhard Schroeder was 38 years old, owned a farm, 1,200 acres of good land, married to Dorothy Mackenzie, daughter of a neighboring farmer, 4 children, Sarah, Thomas, Michael, Emma. Canadian citizen since 1956, member of the community, known as a fair man, good neighbor, hard worker. Ewald Zimmermann was 37, civil engineer, had designed 7 bridges, married to Linda Morrison, 3 children, Robert, Patricia, James, respected professional, member of the Rotary Club, occasionally spoke at schools about his experiences when students asked, talked about the importance of second chances. That spring, Reinhard and Ewald drove to Lethbridge together, wanted to see where Camp 133 had been, the place that changed their lives. The camp was gone, demolished in 1947. The land returned to prairie, just grass and sky like it had been before the war. But there was a small monument, grey granite stone, erected in 1965. Words carved into it. On this site, 1943 to 1946, 12,500 German prisoners of war were held. They were treated with dignity according to international law. Some chose to return to Canada and became citizens. They stood reading it, 2 middle-aged men, successfully integrated into Canadian society, living proof that transformation was possible. A truck pulled up on the road. An old man stepped out, William Henderson, 66 years old, retired, grey hair, deep lines, but the same eyes. He walked toward them, stopped, recognized them after a moment. "Schroeder? Zimmermann?" His voice uncertain. "I remember you. There was a third." Reinhard spoke quietly. "Dieter Wagner. He didn't make it back. He died in 1958. Silence. Henderson's eyes watered. "I had to refuse your request," Henderson said. "I had orders. I've thought about you 3 many times over the years. Wondered what happened." Ewald responded, "You did what the law required, sir. We understand that now." Reinhard added, "But you gave us something more important than permission to stay. You showed us truth, that good people exist on both sides, that mercy is possible even between enemies." Henderson broke. Tears ran down his weathered face. His voice shook. "I fought in the First War. At the Somme. I was 15, saw terrible things. When I had to send you back, I felt like I was sending children back to hell. I'm so glad you found your way back here." They embraced, 3 men, grey-haired Canadian veteran and 2 middle-aged German immigrants, standing on grass where barbed wire once stood, connected by history, by mercy, by the long road that led from enemies to this moment of shared humanity. Reinhard's son Thomas took a photograph. 10 years old, didn't understand the significance, just knew his father asked him to. That photograph became treasured, framed, hung in Reinhard's farmhouse, a reminder that transformation is possible, that second chances matter, that mercy changes the world in ways violence never can. Today, if you drive outside Lethbridge, you'll find almost nothing left of Camp 133. The barracks are gone, the guard towers demolished, the barbed wire torn down in 1947. The land went back to being prairie, just grass and wind and sky. But the monument remains, small, unassuming. Most people drive past without stopping. The approximately 1,000 former prisoners who returned to Canada between 1948 and 1956 lived quiet lives, kept their pasts mostly private. The shame was too great. They told their children they immigrated after the war, didn't mention being prisoners first. So the stories faded, memories disappeared. An entire chapter became something almost nobody talks about. But the legacy remains. 3 truths emerged from Camp 133. First, propaganda is defeated by truth and kindness, not bombs. 12,000 German prisoners spent 2 years treated with dignity and exposed to uncensored information. The vast majority completely rejected Nazi ideology by 1946, more effective than combat for changing minds. Second, children should not bear the guilt of those who controlled them. Reinhard, Ewald, and Dieter were 10 years old when forced to join Hitler Youth. Indoctrinated from childhood, victims and perpetrators simultaneously. The question remains, at what age does someone become responsible for choices made under total control? Third, second chances work when structured with support. 1,000 former prisoners returned to Canada. 98% became productive citizens. 0 criminal records. Keys: education, work, dignity, patience. Proof that transformation is possible even for enemies. Today, child soldiers in Syria, Myanmar, Congo, Yemen face similar questions. Rehabilitate or punish? At what age is someone accountable? Can 16-year-olds forced to fight be saved? Camp 133 suggests yes. If given truth instead of propaganda, work instead of idle punishment, education instead of isolation, dignity instead of revenge. Reinhard Schroeder died in 2004, 75 years old, heart attack. Peacefully in his sleep at home, Dorothy beside him, 12 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren. The farm still operates, Sarah runs it now. Ewald Zimmermann died in 2008, 78 years old, cancer, peacefully at home, Linda and 3 children beside him. The Zimmermann Engineering Award still exists, $5,000 annually for international students at University of Alberta studying civil engineering. Dieter Wagner died in 1958, 28 years old, Dresden. Never escaped the darkness, never found his way back to light. 3 German boys, 3 different endings, 1 truth. Sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but showing them a better way to live. Camp 133 no longer exists, but its legacy endures. That mercy can transform enemies into neighbors, that second chances can rebuild lives, that the long road home sometimes leads away from where you were born and toward where you were meant to be. The monument stands on the prairie. The wind blows, the grass grows, and somewhere in the space between history and hope, the story remains. A reminder that wars end, but their lessons continue. That the choices we make about former enemies define who we are as nations and as humans. That mercy is not weakness. That transformation is possible. That home is not always where you're from, but sometimes where you're finally allowed to become yourself. The boys who refused to go home found something more valuable than geography. They found redemption. They found purpose. They found proof that even in war's aftermath, humanity can survive. That's the legacy. That's what remains. That's what matters. Not the barbed wire or the guard towers or the camps that held enemies, but the mercy that transformed them. The second chances that rebuilt lives. The long road that led from battlefield to farmland, from prisoner to citizen, from enemy to neighbor. That's the story of Camp 133. That's what 3 boys taught a nation. That's what we forget at our peril and remember to our salvation. The prairie wind blows across empty land. The monument stands. The story waits for anyone willing to stop and read and remember. And somewhere, the lesson echoes forward. War creates enemies. Mercy creates citizens. Choose accordingly.